Parks are meant to be peaceful places, but what happened at Riverside Memorial Park that spring became a turning point no one saw coming. A quiet community gathering spot transformed into an unexpected battleground when a ruthless street bike gang chose the wrong person to harass. They didn't know he was a decorated Force Recon veteran. They didn't know about his years of specialized training, and they certainly didn't know how local veterans would unite to protect what was sacred to them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the ancient oak trees at Riverside Memorial Park, casting dappled shadows across the freshly maintained paths where Michael Davidson conducted his usual morning routine. His weathered hands gripped a rake with practiced precision, clearing fallen leaves from around the park's centerpiece, a pristine veterans memorial he'd helped design after returning from his third deployment. The polished granite reflected the early light, names of fallen heroes etched with perfect care and dignity. The park was starting to come alive with its regular morning visitors. Elderly couples walked hand in hand along the winding trails, young mothers pushed strollers through the butterfly garden, and fellow veterans gathered near the memorial's benches, sharing coffee and quiet conversation. The familiar rhythm of it all masked the tension that would soon shatter this peaceful scene. Mac methodically checked the memorial grounds, ensuring every detail was perfect. As the park's lead groundskeeper and memorial caretaker, he'd maintained this sacred space for 5 years, earning respect for keeping it immaculate regardless of weather or season. Other veterans called him the Guardian, always present but never drawing attention to himself, watching over both the living and the memories of the fallen. A young boy struggled with his kite nearby, frustrated tears welling in his eyes as the string tangled. Mac watched for a moment, then walked over, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. The kid couldn't have been more than 8, wearing a Marine Corps cap too big for his head. "Need a hand, young man?" Mac's voice carried the quiet authority of experience. The boy wiped his eyes with his sleeve, nodding. "Can't get it to fly right, sir." Mac knelt beside him, showing him how to properly handle the kite's string. His hands, which had once coordinated complex military operations, now demonstrating the simple joy of flying a kite. The boy watched intently, soaking in every word of instruction. "I'm Mac Davidson," he offered with a gentle smile. "Everyone was new to kite flying once. Just remember, patience and proper technique win the day." As they talked, the first rumble of motorcycles echoed from the park's main entrance. Mac's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted subtly. Years of combat experience had taught him to read situations before they developed, and something about those approaching engines struck a discordant note in his mind. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. If you like this kind of content, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have a special story that will leave you speechless. Inside the park's small cafe, the morning regulars looked up from their coffee cups. Maria herself, who'd run the cafe for 12 years, stood behind the counter, her experienced eyes tracking the growing sound. She'd been here long enough to know the difference between weekend riders and trouble. The motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, chrome glinting harshly in the morning sun. 8 riders, all wearing patches identifying them as members of the Steel Vipers MC, moved with deliberate swagger through the park entrance. The young boy with the kite tensed visibly, but Mac placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Go find your mom," he said quietly. "Some situations are better watched from a distance." The morning sun continued its climb, burning away the last of the dew, but a different kind of chill had settled over Riverside Memorial Park. In the distance, more motorcycle engines could be heard approaching. Mac reached into his groundskeeper card and pulled out his work tablet, making careful notes while keeping his peripheral vision trained on the memorial area. The day was just beginning, but already the pieces were being set on a board that would soon become a battlefield. A tense hour passed at Riverside Memorial Park as the Steel Vipers claimed the central pavilion area, their loud voices and occasional bursts of laughter cutting through the usual morning peace. Regular park visitors found reasons to linger, their morning walks taking them past the memorial more frequently than usual, eyes alert beneath casual expression. Mac continued his groundskeeping duties, methodically trimming hedges while keeping the pavilion in view. His Force Recon training had taught him the value of patience, of watching and waiting before acting. The CB radio in his maintenance cart crackled with coded warnings from other park workers and local veterans. More bikers had been spotted around the neighborhood streets leading to Riverside Park. Inside the cafe, Maria worked with practiced efficiency, her movements calm, but her eyes sharp. 15 years of managing a park cafe had taught her to read trouble like an approaching storm. She'd seen the way the Viper's leader, who called himself Blade, watched the memorial grounds through the window, particularly the collection box for the Children's Veterans Program. "More coffee?" she asked, approaching their table with a fresh pot. Blade looked up, his weathered face creasing into what might have been a smile. "Nice place you got here." "We try to be." Maria's voice carried just the right mix of professional courtesy and careful distance. "Might be staying a while," Blade said, his eyes still on the memorial grounds. "Good spot for community outreach." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implication. Maria topped off their cups without comment, but her mind was already racing. She'd heard rumors about the Steel Vipers, about their protection services in other parks and community spaces across the city. Outside, Mac's radio crackled again. "Guardian, you copy?" Got eyes on 3 more bikes heading down Roosevelt Avenue. Mac picked up his handheld. "Copy that. Keep monitoring." The conversation triggered a memory from his deployment, a hot day in Fallujah, watching insurgents slowly infiltrate a neighborhood. The same patient, predatory approach. A young cafe worker hurried across the grounds, her face tight with concern. She made a beeline for Mac's position, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Mr. Davidson," she kept her voice low. "Maria asked me to tell you they're asking questions about the Memorial Fund collections, especially the weekend deposits." Mac nodded slowly, the pieces starting to fit together. The Steel Vipers had a reputation for targeting community gathering spots, establishing protection rackets that amounted to organized extortion. His mind drifted back to another memory, this one from his final tour. His unit had dealt with similar tactics from local gangs trying to control neighborhood markets. The same predatory pattern, just on different terrain. The pavilion door creaked as Blade emerged with his crew. They moved with deliberate slowness, taking in every detail of the memorial grounds. 2 more motorcycles rumbled into the parking lot, their riders wearing the same Steel Viper patches. Mac watched through his peripheral vision as Blade approached his position, the biker's reflection growing larger in the polished granite of the memorial wall. "Nice setup you got here," Blade called out. "Military man, huh?" Mac continued trimming the hedge line, his movements precise and unhurried. "Something I can help you with?" "Just being neighborly." Blade's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you handle the memorial collections. Lot of generous donors in this neighborhood. Shame if anything happened to disrupt such a worthy cause." The threat was clear, but Mac's expression remained neutral. He'd faced down worse in Fallujah. Appreciate the concern. More motorcycles arrived, their engines echoing off the park buildings. The Steel Vipers were establishing a presence, marking their territory. Inside the cafe, Maria was already on the phone, her voice low and urgent as she spoke with the local police sergeant. The park community had its own way of responding to threats. Regular visitors found reasons to stay longer. Veterans who hadn't planned to visit suddenly felt the need to pay their respects at the memorial, and local residents began appearing with their dogs for unexpected morning walks. Mac's phone buzzed with a text from James Chen, a fellow veteran who ran security at the VA hospital downtown. "Word is these snakes have been hitting community spaces all over the city. 3 parks and a community center last month. Watch yourself, brother." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The message confirmed Mac's suspicions. The Steel Vipers weren't just random troublemakers. They were organized, targeting specific locations. Riverside Park's location and active veteran presence made it a perfect target for their operations. Blade and his crew mounted their bikes. but not before the leader cast one final look at the memorial grounds. "See you around, Marine. Keep the place looking pretty." As they roared away, Maria emerged from the cafe and crossed to Mac's position, her face serious. "Sergeant Thompson says his hands are tied unless they actually break the law. Says there's not much he can do about them just being in the park." She handed him a fresh coffee, watching the bikes disappear around the corner. Mac took the coffee, his mind already working through scenarios. "They're testing the waters," he said quietly, "seeing how we'll react. This isn't their first rodeo." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time to call in some favors. Get word out to the veteran network." The sun climbed higher over Riverside Memorial Park as Mac Davidson made his afternoon rounds, each step measured and deliberate. The morning's confrontation had set something in motion, and now the peaceful park grounds hummed with an underlying tension. Veterans who regularly visited the memorial began arriving in greater numbers, their casual demeanor masking careful observation. Through his earpiece, connected to the park's maintenance channel, Mac heard scattered reports of Steel Viper motorcycles circling the neighborhood. They were mapping the area, learning the routines, identifying entry points and escape routes. It was a familiar pattern, one he'd seen insurgents use before taking control of neighborhoods and combat zones. "Got another pair of bikes doing loops on Henderson Street." Tom Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. The former Marine Scout sniper, now running a local security company, had positioned his people strategically around the park's perimeter. "They're taking photos of the access points," Mac acknowledged with a quiet click of his radio as he approached the memorial wall. A small group of elementary school students was gathered there, their teacher explaining the significance of the names etched in stone. These were the moments that mattered, the reason the memorial needed protecting. "Mr. Davidson?" a voice called from behind him. Sarah Thompson, the sergeant's daughter who taught at the local high school, approached with concern etched on her face. "Dad wanted me to warn you. The Steel Vipers have been asking questions around town. About you specifically." Mac nodded, unsurprised. "They do their homework, part of their intimidation routine." "They found out about Fallujah," Sarah continued, her voice lower. "About what happened at Market Square. The memories surfaced unbidden. A hot day, a similar gang trying to control local merchants, and a Force Recon unit that refused to let it happen. The Steel Vipers were digging into his background looking for leverage, but they were learning the wrong lessons from his history." Inside the cafe, Maria was hosting an unusual gathering. Local business owners, park regulars, and veterans sat scattered at different tables, appearing to enjoy their lunch while quietly sharing information. The Steel Vipers had been systematically targeting community spaces across 3 districts, establishing protection rackets that amounted to carefully organized extortion. "They hit Jefferson Park last week," James Chen reported, joining Mac near the memorial. "Smashed up the playground equipment when the community center refused to pay. Police couldn't prove anything." Mac studied the park grounds, his tactical mind mapping defensive positions and vulnerable points. "They're escalating, getting bolder." A motorcycle engine revved aggressively in the parking lot, a lone Steel Viper watching the memorial grounds. The rider made no move to enter the park, just observed, sending a message. Near the playground, parents gathered their children closer, their enjoyment of the afternoon tainted by unease. "Got word from my contact at City Hall," Maria said, bringing fresh coffee to Mac's position. "The Vipers have been seen meeting with some developer types. Expensive suits, luxury cars. This isn't just about protection money." The pieces were starting to form a clearer picture. Mac had seen similar patterns before, criminal organizations working as muscle for larger interests, softening up communities for development deals that would destroy their character and heritage. His phone buzzed, a message from his old Force Recon team. "Command wants details on the Market Square situation. Similar patterns emerging in other cities. Stay alert, something bigger at play." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the memorial wall as Mac made another circuit of the grounds. More veterans had arrived, some he recognized from his tours, others from local VFW meetings. They moved with purpose, positioning themselves casually but strategically around the park. "They'll be back in force," Tom Martinez predicted, joining Mac near the memorial. Probably tonight. Friday nights are when they like to make statements. Mac checked his watch, mentally reviewing the park's evening schedule. Community movie night. Families, kids. Perfect target for intimidation. Unless someone's ready for them, Tom replied, the former scout sniper's eyes scanning. The grounds. Word spreading through the veteran network. People remember what happened in Jefferson Park. They're not letting it happen here. The maintenance radio crackled again. More steel vipers spotted, more photos being taken, more pressure building. But something else was building too. Something the bikers hadn't counted on. The park wasn't just a piece of public land. It was sacred ground to the veteran community, consecrated by memory and sacrifice. As the afternoon deepened, Mac watched another group of schoolchildren trace the names on the memorial wall with reverent fingers. This was what the Steel Vipers didn't understand. They weren't just threatening a park, they were threatening a legacy. And some legacies were worth fighting for. Time to make our own preparations, Mac said quietly, reaching for his phone. It was time to call in the kind of backup the Steel Vipers wouldn't see coming. The kind that understood that some grounds were sacred, and some fights were about more than just territory. The afternoon shadows lengthened across Riverside Memorial Park as Mac Davidson checked the final preparations for community movie night. On the surface, everything appeared normal. The large projection screen being set up near the central lawn, volunteers arranging rows of chairs, the smell of popcorn wafting from Maria's cafe. But beneath this peaceful scene, a quiet mobilization was taking place. Parameter check. Mac spoke softly into his radio, his voice carrying to the network of veterans now strategically positioned throughout the park. Former military personnel, some still wearing their workplace uniforms from their civilian jobs, had been arriving steadily over the past few hours. North entrance secure, Tom Martinez reported from his position. Got 3 of my security guys in plainclothes, all former Marines. South side covered, came James Chen's response. VA hospital volunteers are setting up a medical awareness booth. All combat medics, all ready. Mac watched families begin to arrive for the movie night. Spreading blankets on the grass, children running excitedly between the rows of chairs. They had no idea they were being protected by a silent guardian force of veterans, positioned to defend their evening of peace. Through his earpiece, reports continued to flow. Steel Viper motorcycles had been circling the neighborhood in growing numbers. The movie night crowd provided perfect cover as more veterans arrived, many with families, carrying lawn chairs and coolers while discreetly checking in with Mac's coordination team. Got movement on Roosevelt Avenue, a voice crackled through the radio. At least 15 bikes forming up. Look like they're waiting for something. Maria approached Mac's position carrying a tray of coffee for the volunteers. Police sergeant called again, she reported quietly. Says he's got patrols in the area, but unless the Vipers actually do something. They're waiting for sunset, Mac replied, his combat-trained eyes scanning the gathering crowd. Maximum intimidation effect. They want to show the community who really controls the park after dark. The projection screen flickered to life as the tech team ran their final checks. The movie, fittingly, was a family-friendly film about standing up to bullies. Near the memorial wall, several combat veterans had set up their viewing spots, their casual positions offering clear sightlines to all park entrances. Mac's phone buzzed with a message from his old Force Recon commander. Intel confirms developer connection. Starling Development Group. They want the parkland, using the Vipers to pressure the community into supporting a safety-based redevelopment plan. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about protection money. It was about breaking the community's spirit, making them feel unsafe in their own park until they'd support anything that promised security, even if it meant losing their memorial grounds. A young mother approached Mac, concern evident in her expression. Mr. Davidson? We've been hearing rumors. Is it safe to stay for the movie? Mac gave her a reassuring smile. Safest place in the city tonight, ma'am. We've got some good people watching over things. As if to challenge his words, the first distant rumble of motorcycles grew louder. The Steel Vipers were making their move just as the sun began to set. Mac watched parents instinctively draw their children closer, but none left. a silent act of defiance that made him proud. "All units, stand ready," he spoke quietly into his radio. "Remember, we're protecting families tonight. Keep it controlled, keep it quiet, but keep them safe." Through the gathering dusk, Mac could see Blade leading his crew toward the park entrances, their bikes moving with practiced coordination. But what the Steel Vipers didn't realize was that they were riding into a carefully prepared defensive position, manned by veterans who had spent careers protecting others from exactly this kind of intimidation. "They're coming in heavy," Tom reported. "Looks like they brought every member they could muster. Want to make a statement?" "Good," Mac replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had faced worse odds. "Let's show them what kind of statements we can make." As the movie's opening credits began to roll, families settled in with their popcorn and blankets, creating a scene of perfect community peace. It was exactly this peace that Mac and his impromptu guardian force had sworn to protect. Not just the physical space of the park, but the right of families to gather without fear. The Steel Vipers were about to learn a hard lesson about choosing their targets. They thought they were dealing with a simple park, an easy community to intimidate. They were about to discover they had picked a fight with an army they never saw coming. The first wave of Steel Vipers rolled into the park's main entrance just as the movie's opening scene filled the giant screen. Their engines, deliberately loud, competed with the film's audio, causing children to huddle closer to their parents. Mac Davidson watched from his position near the memorial wall as Blade led his crew in a slow procession around the viewing area, their bikes weaving between the rows of seated families. "Hold positions," Mac's voice carried quietly through the radio network. "Let them make the first move. We're not the aggressors here." The bikers completed their circuit, parking their machines in a wide semicircle behind the crowd. More Steel Vipers appeared at other park entrances, their numbers now approaching 30. They were putting on a show of force, trying to create an atmosphere of menace and inevitability. "Nice turnout," Blade's voice carried across the grounds as he approached Mac's position. "Real family-friendly. Be a shame if anything disturbed such a peaceful evening." Mac continued his groundskeeping work, calmly adjusting the memorial's lighting for the evening. "Something I can help you with?" "Just making sure everything's secure," Blade replied, running a hand along the memorial wall. "Lot of valuable stuff here. Collection boxes, equipment, memories. World can be dangerous after dark." Through his earpiece, Mac heard the quiet updates from his team. Veterans were slowly repositioning, maintaining their cover as movie watchers while establishing a protective perimeter around the families. Tom Martinez's security team had quietly moved to guard the parking lot exits. "You know," Blade continued, his voice dropping lower, "we've been doing some research on you, Marine. Force Recon, right? Market Square and Fallujah. Impressive stuff. But this isn't a war zone. Different rules here. Is that what you think?" Mac finally turned to face him directly. "That there are different rules for threatening families? For disrespecting a memorial ground?" More Steel Vipers approached, forming a loose circle around Mac and Blade. Behind them, the movie played on, but many in the crowd were now watching the developing situation with growing concern. Parents began quietly gathering their children, preparing to leave. "Nobody's threatening anyone," Blade spread his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. "Just offering community services, protection, maintenance, event security. Small fee, of course. Alternatively?" He glanced meaningfully at the movie screen setup. "Accidents happen, equipment breaks, sometimes people get hurt." Mac's radio crackled softly. "Got 3 more bikes coming in hot from Roosevelt. Looking like trouble." But before the situation could escalate further, something unexpected happened. An elderly man in a wheelchair rolled forward, wearing a Korea veteran's cap. "Evening, Mac," he said calmly, positioning himself between the bikers and the memorial wall. "These fellows bothering you?" "Not at all, Mr. Rodriguez," Mac replied, noting how other veterans in the crowd were now standing, casually moving closer. "Just discussing community services." More veterans emerged from the crowd, their movements unhurried but purposeful. A woman in hospital scrubs who'd served as a combat medic in Afghanistan, A UPS driver still in his brown uniform, his Marine Corps tattoo visible on his forearm. A teenager working the popcorn stand wearing his older brother's army jacket. Quite a community we have here, Mac observed, watching Blade register the changing dynamics. The Steel Vipers were suddenly aware they were surrounded by a different kind of force, not obvious or aggressive, but present and immovable. "You don't want this fight," Blade warned, but his voice carried less conviction now. "We've got backing. Powerful people who want this park's problems solved." "Starling Development?" Mac asked quietly. "Yeah, we know about them too. Amazing what veterans in corporate positions can discover when they start looking." The movie's soundtrack swelled dramatically, providing a fitting backdrop as more community members stood their ground. Maria had emerged from her cafe with a fresh pot of coffee, accompanied by 3 large men who'd served in the same tank battalion in Iraq. "Last chance to do this the easy way," Blade tried, but the threat sounded hollow now. "There is an easy way," Mac agreed. "You leave. You tell your corporate backers that this park is protected. Not by violence or threats, but by a community that remembers what it means to stand together." The standoff stretched for another moment, the movie forgotten as families watched a real-life drama unfold. The Steel Vipers found themselves facing not just a few veterans, but an entire community that had awakened to its own strength. Blade looked around, measuring odds, reading the situation with the cunning that had made him a gang leader. But even he could see this was different from their usual intimidation tactics. These weren't scared shopkeepers or isolated community centers. This was an organized force that knew exactly what it was doing. "This isn't over," he finally said, gesturing to his crew. "Nobody refuses the Vipers' protection. They do when they've got something better," Mac replied calmly. "Something real." As the bikers mounted up, the sound of their engines couldn't quite drown out the spontaneous applause that broke out among the movie night crowd. The Steel Vipers had come to demonstrate their power, but instead, they'd awakened something far stronger: the united will of a community that had found its guardians. The following morning dawned over Riverside Memorial Park with an uneasy calm. Mac Davidson arrived earlier than usual, the first light finding him inspecting the grounds with meticulous care. The Steel Vipers' retreat the previous night hadn't felt like victory, more like the quiet before a storm. "They hit Jefferson Park again last night," Tom Martinez reported, joining Mac near the memorial wall. "After they left here, trashed the community center, spray-painted their tags all over the Veterans Tribute wall. They're sending a message." Mac nodded grimly, studying fresh motorcycle tracks that cut across one of his flower beds. The Vipers had returned sometime in the darkness, not to confront but to demonstrate they could access the park at will. Their tracks circled the memorial deliberately, a calculated show of disrespect. "Got more intel from corporate," James Chen approached, still in his VA hospital scrubs from the night shift. "Starling Development isn't just planning to redevelop this park. They're targeting veteran spaces across 3 districts: community centers, memorials, VFW halls, anywhere that brings veterans together. They want to break up the community." Mac understood the strategy. "Isolate people, make them easier to control. Classic divide and conquer." Maria emerged from her cafe, carrying coffee and concerned news. "Just got word from my cousin at City Hall. Starling's submitting an emergency proposal today, citing increasing community violence as justification for expedited redevelopment. They're using the Steel Vipers' own attacks to push their agenda." The morning sun climbed higher as more veterans arrived, drawn by urgent messages spread through their network overnight. The park's picnic area transformed into an impromptu command center, with former military personnel from all branches sharing intelligence and planning. Mac's phone buzzed with a text from his old Force Recon commander. "Market Square all over again. Same playbook, different players, corporate money backing street muscle to break community resistance. Watch your 6. These developers play dirty." "They're mobilizing for something big," Tom reported, scanning messages from his security network. "Vipers calling in members from other chapters. Spotted 3 trucks unloading bikes at their clubhouse. Whatever they're planning, it's not just going to be intimidation this time." The park filled with its regular morning visitors, but there was a new tension in the air. Parents kept their children closer to the playground equipment. Joggers ran in pairs rather than alone. Every motorcycle sound from the nearby streets caused people to look up anxiously. "We need to change the game," Mac decided, gathering his core team near the memorial. "They expect us to stay defensive, protect the park, react to their moves. Time to take the initiative." Sarah Thompson arrived with fresh intelligence from her father, the police sergeant. "Dad says they've got proof the Vipers are working for Starling. Financial records, phone logs, direct payments. But the development company's lawyers are burying everything in paperwork." "Classic corporate tactics," James added. "Use street muscle for the dirty work, maintain plausible deniability, then sweep in with solutions to the problems they created." Mac studied the memorial wall, his reflection mingling with the engraved names of fallen heroes. "They picked this fight thinking they were dealing with scattered veterans and scared families. Time to show them what they're really up against." Through his radio, reports kept flowing. Steel Vipers gathering in force. Corporate suits spotted at their clubhouse. Private security teams doing surveillance on veteran spaces across the city. The enemy was marshaling its forces, preparing to break the community's will through overwhelming pressure. "They'll hit multiple locations," Tom predicted, his tactical training evident. "Try to stretch us thin, make us choose what to protect and what to sacrifice." "Then we don't play their game," Mac replied, his mind already forming a counter-strategy. "We fight this our way, not just defending spaces, but defending the bonds between them." Maria's phone lit up with urgent news. Starling Development had called an emergency community meeting for that evening. They were accelerating their timeline, trying to capitalize on the fear their Steel Viper proxies had created. "They think they can wear us down," Mac told his gathered allies. "Make us choose between safety and our sacred spaces. But they forgot something important. Veterans don't leave their people behind." As the morning deepened, more community members arrived at the park, drawn by an instinctive understanding that something crucial was at stake. They weren't just fighting for a park or a memorial anymore. They were fighting for the soul of their community, for the right to gather without fear, for the spaces that held their most precious memories. The Steel Vipers and their corporate masters had chosen this battlefield, thinking they were targeting a vulnerable community space. Instead, they had awakened a force they never expected, a network of veterans and citizens ready to stand together against any threat, whether it came roaring on motorcycles or wrapped in corporate paperwork. Mac checked his watch, noting the time of the emergency meeting. "Get the word out," he instructed his team. "Tonight we show them what community really means." The emergency community meeting at City Hall became a turning point no one expected. As Mac Davidson stood at the back of the packed chamber, he watched Starling Development's expensive suits lay out their proposal with practiced sincerity. Their presentation showed glossy images of improved park spaces, complete with high-end retail and security gates. "Recent incidents have highlighted the growing safety concerns in our community spaces," Starling's lead developer, Richard Morrison, addressed the crowd with rehearsed concern. "Our redevelopment plan offers a modern, secure solution to protect our families and honor our veterans with a new, state-of-the-art memorial complex." But something was different tonight. The usually quiet community members weren't sitting in fearful silence. Veterans from Riverside Park had spread throughout the crowd, sharing what they knew about the connection between Starling and the Steel Vipers. "Tell us about your private meetings with the motorcycle gang," a voice called out. James Chen, still in his VA hospital uniform. "The same gang that's been terrorizing our parks?" Morrison's polished facade cracked slightly. "Those are baseless accusations. We're here to discuss solutions, not conspiracy theories." "Got the financial records right here." Tom Martinez stood up, holding a folder. "Transfer dates match perfectly with every incident of vandalism. Quite a coincidence." The corporate team shifted uncomfortably as more community members rose to speak. Parents whose children had been frightened at movie night. Veterans who'd witnessed the Steel Vipers' disrespect of memorial spaces. Local business owners who'd seen the same pattern in other neighborhoods. Mac's radio crackled quietly in his ear. Multiple bikes approaching City Hall. Looks like the Vipers want to add some muscle to their corporate friends presentation. Teams in position, came the response from Tom's security network. The veterans had anticipated this move, positioning their own people at every entrance. Morrison tried to regain control of the meeting. These disruptions only proved the need for professional security and managed access to our public spaces. Our development plan ... is a land grab, Mac finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded men in combat. Using hired thugs to create problems so you can sweep in with solutions. We've seen this playbook before. The chamber doors burst open as Blade and his steel Vipers strode in, their leather vests and heavy boots a stark contrast to the corporate suits at the podium. But they found themselves walking into another carefully prepared position. Veterans stood casually throughout the chamber, many still in their work clothes, postal uniforms, business suits, medical scrubs, each one positioned to protect the civilians around them. The Vipers' attempt at intimidation had instead revealed the true strength of the community. "These men have no place in this official meeting," Morrison protested, but his words rang hollow as someone projected photos onto the wall, surveillance images showing him meeting with Blade at the Steel Vipers clubhouse. "Actually, let them stay," Mac suggested, moving to the front of the chamber. "Let everyone see exactly who's working with who. Let them watch as we show the evidence we've gathered." Sarah Thompson, coordinating with other teachers and parents, began sharing documented timelines. Every Steel Viper incident matched perfectly with Starling Development's property acquisitions. Each act of vandalism was followed by corporate offers to solve the security problems. "You're making some very dangerous accusations," Morrison warned, but the threat in his voice was met with quiet strength from the gathered community. "No," Mac replied. "We're showing proof of what everyone already suspected. You hired thugs to terrorize families, disrespect memorials, and break community bonds, all so you could present yourselves as saviors." Blade moved aggressively toward Mac, but found his path blocked by multiple veterans who seemed to materialize from the crowd. The Steel Vipers were suddenly aware they were outnumbered, not by force but by determined community solidarity. "This development plan is withdrawn," announced a city council member, standing up from her seat. "And I'm calling for a full investigation into Starling Development's activities." Morrison gathered his papers hurriedly, his corporate team retreating from the podium. "This isn't over," he hissed as he passed Mac. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "No," Mac corrected him. "You had no idea who you were dealing with. This isn't just a park or a memorial. It's a community, and we protect our own." The Steel Vipers, their corporate backing exposed, found themselves facing a united front of veterans and citizens. Their intimidation tactics, so effective against isolated targets, crumbled in the face of organized resistance. As the meeting dissolved into excited discussion, Mac's phone buzzed with messages from other communities facing similar threats. The story was spreading, inspiring other neighborhoods to stand up against corporate-backed intimidation. "They'll try something else," Tom warned, joining Mac as the chamber cleared. "People like that don't give up easily." "Good," Mac replied, watching the last of the Steel Vipers retreat from City Hall. "Because neither do we." The battle for Riverside Memorial Park had become something larger, a symbol of community resistance against those who would use fear and money to destroy sacred spaces. And it was far from over. The retaliation came at midnight. Mac Davidson was finishing his final park inspection when the first motorcycles roared past the entrance. Not just Steel Vipers this time. Multiple gangs called in as reinforcements. Their headlights cut through the darkness like predatory eyes, converging on Riverside Memorial Park from all directions. "Multiple contacts." Tom Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. "Counting at least 40 bikes. They're not just sending a message this time. They're bringing war." Mac moved calmly toward the memorial wall, his steps measured and deliberate. Through his earpiece, he heard the rapid coordination of his veteran network. They had prepared for this, knowing that exposed corruption often led to desperate violence. "Got corporate security vehicles moving in too," James Chen reported from his observation point. "Black SUVs, professional operators. Starling's not even trying to hide their connection anymore." The bikes surrounded the park's perimeter, their engines growling in the darkness. Behind them, dark vehicles took up strategic positions. Mac reached the memorial wall just as Blade dismounted his motorcycle, leading a column of bikers toward the central grounds. "You should have taken the deal," Blade called out, his voice carrying across the darkened park. "Now we do this the hard way." "There's still time to walk away," Mac responded, his voice steady. "You're not just threatening me anymore. Look around." As if on cue, lights began coming on in the surrounding buildings, windows filled with watching faces, phones recorded from balconies. The community wasn't hiding in fear. They were witnessing, documenting, standing together. "You think some cameras scare us?" Blade laughed, but there was an edge to it. "By morning, this memorial will be rubble. Sometimes things have to be destroyed before they can be developed." The corporate security teams emerged from their vehicles carrying suspicious duffel bags. Mac's combat instincts recognized the shapes within: demolition equipment. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. Starling. Development plan to create their own emergency situation. "Maria, activate the protocol," Mac spoke quietly into his radio. Across the park, hidden security lights blazed to life, illuminating every corner of the grounds. And in that sudden brightness, Blade and his forces realized they weren't alone. Veterans emerged from concealed positions throughout the park. Not just a few this time, dozens of them. Some still in their work uniforms, others in casual clothes, but all moving with the coordinated precision of military training. They had been waiting, prepared, ready to protect their sacred ground. "What's this supposed to be?" Blade demanded, but his voice carried less conviction now. "Some kind of civilian militia?" "No," Mac replied, stepping forward. "This is community. This is what happens when you threaten something people hold sacred." The steel vipers revved their engines, trying to maintain their intimidating facade, but uncertainty had crept into their ranks. They were used to terrorizing isolated targets, not facing organized resistance. A corporate security leader approached Blade, speaking urgently in his ear. They hadn't expected this level of preparation, this degree of coordination. Their plan had relied on quick, overwhelming force against minimal resistance. "Last chance," the security leader called out to Mac. "We have legal authorization for emergency demolition. Anyone interfering will be dealt with." "Legal authorization?" Mac's voice carried clearly across the grounds. "Like these?" He held up his phone, displaying documents that made the corporate team freeze. Amazing what veterans in city offices can discover when they start looking. More community members were arriving now, drawn by the commotion, not approaching, but bearing witness from the surrounding streets. Phones recorded everything. Local news vans appeared, their cameras capturing the standoff. "You're done here," Mac continued, his words meant for both the bikers and their corporate masters. "The demolition permits are fake, the development plans are exposed, and every second of this is being broadcast live." The corporate security team retreated first, recognizing a lost cause. Without their backing, the Steel Vipers' advantage of numbers meant less. They were no longer faceless intimidators. They were exposed, documented, their connection to corporate corruption revealed for all to see. "This ain't over," Blade snarled, but he was already backing toward his bike. "Nobody stands against the Vipers." "We do," Mac replied simply, gesturing to the gathered veterans and community members. "We stand together." The motorcycles roared to life, their riders retreating into the night. But they left something behind, the understanding that some places couldn't be bought, some communities couldn't be broken, and some bonds were stronger than any force of intimidation. As the last bikes disappeared, cheers erupted from the surrounding buildings. Community members flooded into the park, no longer afraid. The memorial wall stood untouched, its polished surface reflecting the unity of those who had protected it. "They'll be back," Tom warned, joining Mac by the memorial. "Different tactics, different pressure points." "Let them come," Mac replied, watching families reclaim their park with joy and relief. "We'll be ready. Some things are worth protecting no matter the cost." The night had proven something powerful, that when communities stand together, when veterans unite with civilians, No force of intimidation could prevail against their combined strength. The morning after the failed attack, Riverside Memorial Park hummed with unprecedented activity. News crews clustered near the entrance, their cameras focused on the memorial wall where Mac Davidson continued his regular maintenance routine, seemingly unchanged by the night's events. But everything had changed. "You're going to want to see this," James Chen called out, hurrying across the grounds with his tablet. Starling Development's stock is in freefall. The videos from last night went viral. Their connection to the Steel Vipers, the fake demolition permits, everything. Mac nodded, carefully trimming the hedges along the memorial path. Corporate corruption doesn't do well in sunlight. More vehicles arrived, but not motorcycles this time. FBI agents emerged from unmarked cars, their attention focused on gathering evidence. The Steel Vipers' attempted show of force had backfired spectacularly, exposing the full scope of corruption that had threatened the community. "Got word from my contact at City Hall," Sarah Thompson approached, her face bright with excitement. "They're launching a full investigation into all of Starling's development projects. Other communities are coming forward with similar stories: hired intimidation, fake safety concerns, corrupt officials." The park's cafe had become an impromptu command center, with Maria serving coffee to a mix of federal agents, local veterans, and community organizers. The story had grown beyond just one park's resistance. It had become a blueprint for communities fighting corporate takeover attempts. "Look at this," Tom Martinez called out, showing Mac his phone. The screen displayed news reports from across the city. Other neighborhoods were organizing their own veteran networks, establishing community watches, protecting their sacred spaces. The ripple effect was spreading. Mac's radio crackled with an urgent message. "Multiple Steel Vipers spotted leaving town. Looks like they're cutting their losses." "Not just them," James added, reading from his tablet. "Starling's CEO resigned this morning. Board members are distancing themselves. The whole scheme is unraveling." But amid the celebration, Mac noticed something that concerned him. Black SUVs still circulated the neighborhood, their corporate security teams now watching with cold calculation rather than intimidation. This wasn't over. It was evolving. "They're adapting," he told his core team, gathered near the memorial. "Corporate types don't give up power easily. They'll try something more subtle next time." His phone buzzed with a message from his old Force Recon commander. "Market square lessons applied perfectly, but watch for the counterattack. These people play long games." The morning deepened as more community members arrived, many bringing flowers to place at the memorial. What had begun as a fight to protect a park had transformed into something larger, a statement about community power and unified resistance. "Federal task force wants to talk to us," Tom reported. "They're investigating similar patterns in other cities. Corporations using street muscle to force development deals." Maria emerged from her cafe with fresh intelligence. "My cousin at City Hall says they found more documents. Starling had plans for dozens of communities. Veteran spaces were always the first targets. Break the strongest community bonds first." Mac watched a group of school children approach the memorial wall, their teacher explaining its significance with renewed pride. The night's events had taught them something valuable about community strength and standing together against intimidation. "We've got company," James warned, nodding toward the park entrance. A group of suits had arrived, not Starling this time, but representatives from other development companies. They walked the grounds with careful attention, taking notes, assessing. "They're studying our response," Mac observed. "Learning from Starling's mistakes. Next time it won't be bikers and obvious threats. It'll be paperwork and legal pressure." Sarah's phone lit up with alerts from other teacher friends. Similar situations were emerging across the state. Corporate interests targeting community spaces, looking for vulnerabilities. But now communities had a template for resistance, a model for standing together. "It's spreading," Tom noted, showing Mac more social media posts. Other veteran groups are organizing, creating networks, protecting their communities. What happened here didn't just save our park, it started something bigger. Mac nodded, understanding the deeper implications. They thought they could break community bonds to take our spaces. Instead, they made those bonds stronger. The memorial wall gleamed in the morning sun, its polished surface reflecting more than just names now. It reflected the strength of a community that had found its voice, its power, its unity. The Steel Vipers were gone. Starling development was in chaos, but the real victory was in the awakening of community consciousness. "We'll need to stay ready," Mac told his gathered allies. "This was just one battle in a longer war. Corporations will keep coming for community spaces, trying to turn sacred ground into profit centers." "Let them come," Maria replied. The sentiment echoed in nods from veterans and civilians alike. "We know how to stand together now. Some things are worth protecting no matter what." The morning sun climbed higher over Riverside Memorial Park, illuminating not just a protected space, but a transformed community. They had faced down corporate greed and organized intimidation, emerging stronger, more unified, more determined to protect what mattered. 3 months after the Steel Vipers' retreat, Riverside Memorial Park had transformed into something far more than just a community gathering space. Mac Davidson noticed it in the daily rhythms: the increased foot traffic, the new faces at the memorial wall, the sense of ownership that radiated from every visitor. The park had become a symbol of successful community resistance. Another group visiting from upstate, Tom Martinez reported, watching a bus unload at the entrance. Third this week. They're all facing similar situations. Corporate developers, hired intimidation, threatened community spaces. Mac continued his morning maintenance routine, but his role had evolved. Beyond keeping the grounds pristine, he had become an unofficial advisor to other communities fighting similar battles. The Riverside strategy, as people called it, was being studied and adapted across the country. "Got the latest numbers from the federal task force," James Chen approached, tablet in hand. 12 more development companies under investigation. The pattern's the same everywhere. Target veteran spaces first, break community bonds, force through redevelopment plans. Inside the cafe, Maria hosted regular strategy sessions. Community leaders from other districts gathered to learn how Riverside had united against corporate pressure. The lessons weren't just about physical security, they were about strengthening social bonds, organizing networks, and standing together. "Jefferson Park's transformation is almost complete," Sarah Thompson shared excitedly. Their veteran network helped rebuild everything the Steel Vipers destroyed, the community centers stronger than ever. Mac's radio crackled with routine updates, but they were different now. Instead of tracking threats, the network coordinated community activities, mentorship programs, and veteran outreach. The defensive system they'd built had evolved into something more constructive. "You should see the corporate boardrooms these days," James said, reading from his phone. "They've got a new term, community resistance factor. They have to calculate the cost of united neighborhood opposition before even considering development projects." The memorial wall had gained new significance. Beyond honoring fallen heroes, it stood as a testament to the power of community solidarity. Fresh flowers appeared daily, not just from local residents, but from visitors inspired by Riverside's stand against corruption. "Got word from the city council," Maria reported during the morning briefing. "They're passing new protection laws for community spaces. No more emergency development claims, no more rushed permits. Everything has to go through full community review." Mac watched a group of veterans leading a youth program near the memorial. Former Steel Vipers territory had been transformed into a mentorship space, where military precision now served to build rather than intimidate. "Sometimes I think Starling did us a favor," Tom mused, joining Mac by the memorial. "They wanted to break community bonds. Instead, they made them stronger than ever." The park's transformation had ripple effects throughout the neighborhood. Local businesses reported increased activity. Crime rates dropped as community engagement rose. The veteran network had evolved into a positive force for neighborhood development. Another corporate team spotted doing surveillance, came a radio report, but different this time. "They're studying our community programs, not looking for vulnerabilities." Mac's phone buzzed with a message from his old Force Recon commander. "Your stand at Riverside is changing corporate strategies nationwide. They're learning it's cheaper to work with communities than against them." Sarah organized regular educational programs at the memorial, teaching students about both military history and civic engagement. The park had become a living classroom for community empowerment. "Got an interesting proposal," James said, showing Mac his tablet. "Some of the smaller development companies want to meet. They're talking about new models, community-led development, veteran involvement in planning. Your resistance created a new business approach." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds as Mac completed his rounds. Every corner of the park held memories of their stand against the Steel Vipers and Starling development, but those memories now served as foundation stones for something greater. "You know what really changed?" Maria reflected, bringing coffee to Mac's usual spot near the memorial. "People remembered they have power when they stand together. That's something no corporation can buy." The park hummed with activity. Families enjoying the spaces, veterans sharing stories, community leaders planning future initiatives. What had begun as a defensive stand against corruption had blossomed into a model for positive community transformation. "We've got requests from 3 more cities," Tom reported. "They want to learn how to build veteran networks, how to organize community resistance, how to protect their sacred spaces." Mac nodded, watching the diverse crowd enjoying their park. "Send them everything we've learned. Some victories need to be shared." The sun set over Riverside Memorial Park, its light catching the polished surface of the memorial wall. The names of fallen heroes now reflected not just memories of sacrifice, but the living strength of a community that had found its voice, its power, and its purpose. They had defended their sacred space against corporate greed and organized intimidation. But more importantly, they had created a blueprint for other communities to stand together, to protect what mattered, to transform resistance into renewal. The battle for Riverside Memorial Park had ended, but its legacy was just beginning, spreading hope and inspiration to communities nationwide. Some victories, Mac knew, echoed far beyond their original battlegrounds. 1 year after the Steel Vipers' defeat, Mac Davidson stood at the Riverside Memorial Park entrance, watching the sunrise paint the morning sky in shades of promise. The park had transformed beyond anything they could have imagined that tense night when bikers threatened their sacred space. What began as a stand against intimidation had grown into a nationwide movement. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Tom Martinez said, joining Mac for their morning inspection. "Sometimes I still expect to hear motorcycles roaring up to the entrance." "Different sounds now," Mac replied, noting the pleasant chatter of early morning visitors, veterans leading exercise groups, families enjoying breakfast picnics, community leaders gathering for planning sessions. The park had become more than a memorial space. It was a living symbol of community empowerment. "Got the latest report from the federal task force," James Chen approached, his VA hospital shift just ending. "Starling Development's former executives are facing criminal charges. The evidence trail led to similar operations in 12 states. They were using the same playbook everywhere." Mac watched a group of former Steel Vipers members, now reformed and working with the community, helping to set up for the day's veteran outreach program. The transformation wasn't just in the park, it was in the people themselves. "City Council's using us as a model," Sarah Thompson reported, arriving with fresh coffee from Maria's Cafe. "They're implementing community protection zones around all veteran spaces. No fast-track development, no emergency permits, full neighborhood oversight of any changes." The memorial wall gleamed in the morning light, its surface recently expanded to include a new section honoring civic courage, recognizing those who stood up for their communities. Local children had taken to leaving drawings alongside the flowers, artwork depicting their version of the night the community united against corruption. "Corporate worlds completely changed their approach," James noted, checking his tablet. "Development companies are hiring veteran advisors, creating community liaison offices. They call it the Riverside Protocol, engaging with neighborhoods instead of trying to break them." Mac's radio crackled with updates, but they were different now. Instead of tracking threats, the network coordinated community programs, mentorship initiatives, and inter-neighborhood cooperation. What they'd built for defense had become a foundation for growth. "Remember what Blade said that night?" Tom mused. "Nobody stands against the Vipers." Now his old clubhouse is a veteran resource center. Funny how things turn out. Maria emerged from her cafe, which had evolved into an unofficial community center. Just got word from that neighborhood in Texas we advised last month. They successfully blocked a similar development scheme. Said they followed our playbook exactly. The morning deepened as more visitors arrived. Some were locals enjoying their park, others were community leaders from other cities, coming to learn from Riverside's example. The lessons weren't just about resisting corruption, they were about building something stronger in its place. "You know what really changed?" Sarah observed, watching a veteran group lead a youth leadership program. People stopped seeing themselves as victims waiting for protection. They remembered they could be protectors themselves. Mac's phone buzzed with a message from his old Force Recon commander. "Your stand at Riverside didn't just save one park. It changed how communities fight back against corruption. Proud of you, Marine." The park had become a living classroom for civic engagement. Regular workshops taught community organizing, veteran support networks shared resources, and neighborhood leaders learned strategies for protecting sacred spaces. The defensive skills they'd developed had transformed into tools for community building. "Got something to show you," Tom said, leading Mac to the park's new community center. Inside, a wall displayed maps marking communities that had successfully adapted the Riverside strategy. The markers spread across the country like stars, each representing a neighborhood that had found its strength. "They thought they could break us," Maria reflected, joining them at the map. "Instead, they showed us how strong we really are when we stand together." The memorial wall caught the full morning sun now, its polished surface reflecting more than names and dates. It reflected the face of every visitor, every community member, every person who understood that some spaces were sacred, not just for what they remembered, but for what they inspired. "You know what Starling never understood?" Mac said, watching children place fresh flowers by the memorial. "You can't buy community spirit. You can't intimidate people into forgetting what matters. Some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost." The park filled with its daily rhythm, families enjoying the spaces, veterans sharing stories, community leaders planning new initiatives. What had begun as a desperate stand against corruption had blossomed into a model for positive change. "We've got requests from 5 more cities this week," James reported. "They all want to know the same thing: how to build community networks, how to organize resistance, how to protect their sacred spaces." Mac nodded, understanding that their victory had never really been about one park or one community. It was about remembering that when people stand together, no force of corruption or intimidation could break their bonds. The morning sun reached its full height over Riverside Memorial Park, illuminating not just a protected space, but a transformed community. They had faced down corporate greed and organized intimidation, emerging stronger, more unified, more determined to protect what mattered. And somewhere, in communities across the nation, others were learning the same lesson: that some battles were worth fighting, some spaces were worth protecting, and some victories belonged to everyone who dared to stand together. 5 years after the Steel Vipers confrontation, Riverside Memorial Park hosted a special gathering that no one could have imagined during those tense nights of conflict. Mac Davidson stood at his familiar post near the memorial wall, watching representatives from over 50 communities across the nation share their stories of successful resistance against corporate corruption and community intimidation. "It's like a reunion of warriors," Tom Martinez observed, now running a nationwide network of veteran-led community security consultants. "But the battles they're fighting aren't with guns or fists. They're with unity and determination." The park had evolved far beyond its original design. New paths connected the memorial to community gathering spaces, youth leadership centers, and veteran support facilities. What began as a sacred space to honor the fallen had grown into a living monument to community strength. Latest statistics just came in, James Chen reported, presenting data from his national research project. Communities with veteran-led protection networks report a 90% decrease in corporate intimidation tactics. The Riverside effect has literally changed how development happens in this country. Mac watched a group of corporate representatives, not adversaries now, but partners, meeting with community leaders near Maria's Cafe, which had expanded into a full community center. They were discussing new models of neighborhood development, that prioritized preservation of sacred spaces and veteran involvement in planning. Remember when Blade threatened to turn this place to rubble? Sarah Thompson mused, now heading a nationwide education initiative on community empowerment. Look at it now. It's stronger than ever, and not just physically. The memorial wall had doubled in size, but not to add more names of the fallen. The new sections honored communities that had successfully defended their sacred spaces, creating a living history of citizen empowerment. Children on school trips now learned not just about military sacrifice, but about the power of united communities. Got an interesting report, Maria called out, emerging from her center with fresh intelligence. Some of the development companies that used to hire intimidation gangs, they're now leading advocates for community-based planning, say it's better for business to work with neighborhoods than against them. Max Radio Network, once used to coordinate defense against bikers, now connected community leaders across the country. Every day brought new stories of neighborhoods standing together, of sacred spaces protected, of corruption exposed and defeated. You know what really changes them? Tom reflected, watching a former Steel Viper, now a youth mentor, leading a group of teenagers on a history tour. When they realize that real strength isn't about intimidation, it's about bringing people together. The park hosted regular training sessions now, teaching other communities the lessons learned during their stand against Starling development. But the curriculum went beyond defensive tactics. It included community building, veteran integration, youth mentorship, and sustainable neighborhood development. 5 years, James mused, checking his records. In that time, over 300 communities have successfully adapted the Riverside strategy. Not one sacred space lost to corporate takeover since the network began. Mac's phone buzzed with a message from his old Force Recon commander, now heading a federal task force on community protection. Your stand at Riverside didn't just save one park, it changed how America thinks about community power. The gathering at the park had drawn media attention, but not for conflict this time. Cameras captured stories of transformation, how a movement born in resistance had evolved into a model for positive community development. Veterans who once fought overseas now led battles for neighborhood preservation, armed with strategies that united rather than divided. The real victory, Sarah observed, watching children play freely in spaces once threatened by corporate greed, wasn't just stopping the bad guys, it was showing people a better way forward. Maria had expanded her operation beyond coffee and meals. Her community center now housed a training academy for neighborhood leaders, teaching everything from veteran support programs to corporate negotiation strategies. The lessons of Riverside were being formalized, documented, and shared. Got requests from overseas now, Tom reported, showing Mac his tablet. Communities in Europe and Asia want to learn the model. Turns out sacred spaces need protecting everywhere. The memorial wall caught the afternoon sun, its polished surface reflecting not just the gathered crowd, but the spirit of transformation they represented. What began as one community's stand against intimidation had grown into an international movement for neighborhood empowerment. You know what Starling development taught us? Mac said, addressing a group of visiting community leaders. Sacred spaces aren't just about the past. They're about the future we choose to build together. As the sun set on another day at Riverside Memorial Park, the gathered representatives shared final stories and made new connections. They had come to learn about resistance, but they were leaving with lessons about renewal, about the power of unity, about the strength found in standing together. The park had become more than a symbol of resistance. It was a beacon of hope, a template for transformation, a living proof that when communities unite to protect what matters, they discover strengths they never knew they had. And somewhere, in neighborhoods across the world, others were learning the same powerful truth, that some victories belong not just to those who won them, but to all who dare to stand together in defense of sacred spaces and community bonds. The legacy of Riverside lived on, not in the defeat of enemies, but in the endless ripples of positive change that flowed from one community's courage to stand together against intimidation and corruption. They had not just protected a park, they had shown the world that united communities could never be broken. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.